The Quiet Storm. Chapter 1. The Quiet Storm. The lamps hummed with that faint, electric sound old things make when they try to keep living. She sat by the window, knees drawn up, wrapped in the same gray blanket she used years ago in the mountains. He poured another drink, though the first one still sat untouched beside the chair. Outside, the sea kept breaking itself on the rocks. Inside, they pretended it was only weather. "You should have left it there," she said, eyes on the window. "Some things don't belong in memory." He didn't answer. He took a slow sip instead, tasting more salt than whiskey. "You came back," she said. "I had to." "Had to?" He looked at her then, really looked. "I don't sleep well when things end badly." She smiled a little, not kindly. "We didn't end badly, Tom. We just ended." He turned to the fire, though it hadn't caught well. The logs hissed like something resisting warmth. "It felt bad enough from my side." "That's because you always want a reason." And there wasn't one. He sat down across from her. Between them stood a low table with a single book, a ring mark, and a shell she'd brought back from their first summer here. He reached for it. She stopped him halfway with a look. "Don't," she said. "It breaks easily." They stayed like that a while, her with her knees to her chest, him with his hand hovering over the past. The wind rattled the window. Somewhere in the distance, a buoy clanged, slow and tired. "You still paint?" he asked. "When I can't afford the sadness." He nodded. "Then you must be good at it." She gave a short laugh. "No, just practiced." He wanted to say something about practice, about how some things only get heavier with repetition, but the thought slipped away. The clock ticked from the mantel, marking the minutes between them. "I wasn't sure you'd come," she said after a while. "I wasn't sure either," he said. Then the storm came. "I thought it might wash something clean." And did it? He looked out the window. The tide was still high, black and restless. "No, it just rearranged the debris." She leaned her head against the glass. "You always talk like that. Like every sentence should mean something. Maybe I'm afraid of the ones that don't." The wind rose again, lifting the edge of the blanket around her shoulders. For a moment, she looked small, almost childlike. Then she pulled it tighter, as if remembering who she was. "You shouldn't have come," she said softly. He stood. "I know." Neither moved closer. The silence between them had shape and color now, gray like the sky before dawn. When he finally set the glass down, it left a ring beside the shell. He looked at both, side by side, and thought they suited each other, something fragile and something that stains. Then he turned toward the door. Outside, the sea was still speaking in its old, broken rhythm. Behind him, she said his name once, not to stop him, just to remember how it sounded. Chapter 2. The Weight of Quiet. When the door closed, the sound stayed in the room longer than it should have. She listened until the echo disappeared, then waited a little more, as if he might come back just to tell her he wouldn't. The fire had gone out. Smoke rose in thin gray lines, curling like old handwriting. She stirred the embers once, then let them die the rest of the way. The glass he'd left still held the shape of his fingerprints. She lifted it, not to drink, but to feel the warmth he left behind. It wasn't there. The sea was louder now. It filled the windows, pressing against the silence inside. She remembered when its sound used to comfort her, when it meant wind in the sails, long mornings painting on the shore, the promise of his boat returning. Now it only sounded like distance. She walked to the table and looked at the shell. It had cracked once, years ago, and she'd glued it back so neatly that only she could see the seam. He had forgotten that. Of course he had. She ran a finger along its curve. "You always break the things you love," she whispered. "Then you expect them to hold their shape." The words startled her, not for what they meant, but for the sound of her own voice in the empty room. She went to the window. The harbor lights flickered through the mist, small and stubborn. Somewhere out there, he was walking the long road back to the inn, the wind pulling at his coat, the past pulling harder. He had said the storm didn't wash anything clean. She knew he was wrong. It had washed her clean, of excuses, of waiting, of the quiet kind of hope that poisons you slowly. Still, when she turned from the window, her eyes fell to the letter hidden beneath the floorboard. It was his, written years ago, after Madrid. She had never opened it. She didn't need to. The weight of it had said enough. She knelt and lifted the board. The envelope was still there, wrapped in a thin ribbon the color of sea glass. For a moment, she almost tore it open. Almost. Instead, she placed it back and let the board settle into place. She stood, brushed the dust from her hands, and said to the empty room, "He'll be back by morning." The sea answered with a single wave, hard against the rocks, as if it knew the truth better than she did. Then she turned out the lamp. The darkness was immediate, almost kind. Chapter 3. The Morning After the Sea. The morning came without sunlight. Only a pale gray drift through the curtains, soft as dust. She woke to the sound of gulls fighting over something unseen, their cries sharp against the calm. The chair where he had sat was still angled toward the window. The glass still on the table. The shell still there, unbroken, but close. She made coffee out of habit. The sound of the kettle filled the room like conversation once did. When she sat down, she half expected to see him walking back from the shore, coat dark with sea mist, the look of a man who'd changed his mind. But the road was empty, and the air held that clean, hollow scent that comes after storms and goodbyes. She drank slowly. Each sip seemed to ask what she was waiting for. On the far wall hung one of her paintings, a small one, unfinished. The sea at twilight, two figures near the edge, no faces yet. She had painted them from memory, not from truth. Truth was Messier. Truth didn't stand still long enough to be painted. She went to the easel and touched the edge of the canvas. Her hands smelled faintly of turpentine and smoke. She said, quietly, "You can't paint absence." The sound of it startled her again, as if her own voice were an intruder in the house. She set out new paint, though she hadn't planned to. The brush trembled a little at first, then steadied. She worked until the light began to shift, slow strokes, then harder ones, the kind that dig at the canvas like regret. When she finally stepped back, the sea in the painting was rougher, darker. The figures had blurred together, caught in a wave. It wasn't what she meant to paint, but it was what the truth demanded. She went to the window again. The tide had gone out, leaving the sand streaked and shining like old glass. Something moved near the water, a gull, a piece of driftwood, or maybe nothing at all. She thought of him again, of the way he said her name like it hurt to remember it, and of the silence that followed. He would not come back this time. She knew that now, the way the sea knows where it must break. She closed the window and stood there, holding the edge of the frame. The cold wood pressed against her skin, grounding her. Then she whispered to no one, "It's better this way. We always love the wrong tide." The words hung there, soft and final. Outside, the sea began to rise again, slow, patient, inevitable. Chapter 4. What the Sea Brings Back. By noon, the fog had settled low across the harbor. It blurred the world into soft outlines, the boats, the cliffs, the line where water met sky. From her window, it all looked half-finished, as if the painter had stopped midway and never returned. She moved through the rooms without thinking, opened a drawer, closed it again, folded the blanket, unfolded it. Everything she touched seemed to hum with what used to be. At last she stepped outside. The air was cool, dense, tasting faintly of iron and salt. Down the slope, the path to the beach wound between the dunes. The grass there leaned one way, then the other, restless in the wind. She walked barefoot. The sand was damp, soft where the tide had drawn back. Each step left a mark that filled slowly with water, like a small forgetting. Near the rocks, something pale caught her eye, a piece of driftwood at first, but not quite. She bent down and saw the corner of paper, swollen and creased from the sea. A letter. The writing was faint, the ink dissolved into thin blue ghosts. Only the first line could still be read. "If you ever come back to the harbor." She held it carefully, as if it might still be warm from a hand that meant those words. It wasn't. It was cold, salt-stiff, almost gone. For a long while she stood there, wind in her hair, the sea pulling at the edges of her coat. She wanted to cry, but the moment didn't ask for tears, only for stillness. She looked toward the horizon, the place where his boat would have been. The water shimmered there, calm and endless. She folded the ruined letter once, then again, and slipped it into her pocket. Later, she would place it beside the old, unopened one under the floorboard. Not to keep, just to let the past know it had been found. As she turned to walk back, the fog began to lift. The first thread of sunlight broke through, thin and gold, striking the water like memory, trying to forgive itself. She stopped and watched it until the tide reached her feet. Then she whispered, not to him this time, but to the sea itself, "You keep everything, don't you?" The sea answered in the only way it knew, by coming closer. Chapter 5. the road from the harbor. He had walked most of the night, though he couldn't say why. The road climbed away from the coast, bending through fields that smelled of wet earth and fennel. The wind followed him, steady and without pity. At dawn, he stopped by a small inn on the ridge. The woman behind the counter gave him coffee and a look that said she'd seen this kind of man before, the kind who leaves before he can be left. He sat near the window, hands around the cup, watching fog drift over the valley. It was strange, he thought, how quiet guilt can be when it's finished making excuses. He tried to write, as he always did after leaving something undone. The page stayed blank. Words didn't come easily anymore. They asked too much truth. He folded the notebook shut and placed it beside the cup. By noon, he was on the road again, walking slower now. The sea had vanished behind the hills, but he could still hear it somewhere in the wind. The old, patient sound of return. He thought of her then, standing by the window, hair unpinned, the blanket around her shoulders. The look in her eyes had not been anger. It had been knowing. He smiled at that, though it hurt. Knowing was worse than anger. Anger ended. Knowing stayed. At the next turn, he stopped. Below him lay the inlet, a thin silver thread where the river met the sea. Something glimmered near the waterline, small and white. He climbed down. It was a letter, or what was left of one. His letter, the one he'd written years ago and never sent. He recognized his own handwriting, blurred but certain. He turned it over in his hands, half expecting it to speak. It didn't. The sea had taken the words, left only the weight. He laughed once, quietly. "You found it," he said to the air. Then, almost gently, he tore what remained and let the pieces fall into the tide. They floated for a moment before the current drew them under. He stood there a while, the wind pushing at his coat, his eyes on the horizon. He thought about walking back. He even took one step in that direction, then another, smaller one. But the sea spoke again, in its low, relentless language, and he understood it was too late for return. He turned toward the hills. The road rose before him, empty and familiar. When he reached the top, he looked back one last time. The fog had cleared. The harbor lay still beneath the light, the color of old pewter. He whispered her name, not for her to hear, but to let it go. Then he kept walking, and the wind carried the rest. Chapter 6. The sea holds everything. The afternoon light lies flat on the water. He walks along the ridge, coat open, eyes half closed against the wind. Down below, the tide folds in and out, the sound of an old promise repeating itself. She stands at her window. The fog has burned away, leaving a sharp, clear world. She can see the road climbing the hill, a single figure moving through the sunlight. He stops. He doesn't look back, not yet. She doesn't wave. She only rests her hand against the glass, as if that small touch could bridge the distance. The air is thin, the kind that carries sound farther than it should. A gull cries somewhere between them, brief, broken, gone. He turns once, just enough to see the outline of the house. From where he stands, it looks smaller than memory, brighter than regret. He raises his hand. Not a farewell, not a call, just the motion of someone acknowledging what still lives inside him. She sees it. She knows it is enough. The wind shifts. The smell of salt and smoke drifts through the room. She whispers, "Go on." And he does. Down the road, the sea beside him, endless and alive. Behind him, the house fades into light. The tide keeps moving. It always does.